Hey everyone, she was just a child when she began to notice how differently the world treated her compared to her brothers, cousins, or classmates. It wasn't obvious at first. It never is. Inequality doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers through everyday moments, through expectations so deeply ingrained they feel like truth. While the boys around her were encouraged to speak up, climb trees, explore boldly, she was told to sit properly, lower her voice, and act like a lady. Even in moments that felt innocent, like being handed a doll instead of a book about space, the message was clear: dreams had gender, roles had rules, and she was expected to stay within the ones assigned to her. In her home, she watched as decisions were made without the input of women, even though the women carried the weight of the family on their backs. Her mother, her aunts, her older sisters, strong, smart, intuitive women, were expected to obey and endure. They were praised for sacrifice, but rarely for strength. Their brilliance was reduced to duty. When men made mistakes, they were forgiven with laughter. When women did, they were scolded into silence. She began to understand the difference wasn't in ability, it was in permission, and that permission was always harder for a girl to earn. At school, she sat at the back when the boys were automatically picked to lead. If she raised her hand too often, she was called bossy. If she stayed quiet, she was obedient. Either way, her presence was defined not by what she brought to the table, but by how well she could blend into the background. She saw how easily boys were allowed to take up space on the field, in the classroom, in conversations, while she was expected to shrink herself to make others comfortable. The world was teaching her, in 1,000 small ways, that her voice had limits. And she started asking herself why. She would hear elders say things like, "That's not ladylike," or "She's too forward for a girl," while the same behavior from boys was met with pride. "Boys will be boys," they'd say, smiling. But girls, they were held to an invisible code, a rule book they never agreed to, but were expected to follow without question. She began to recognize that the unequal treatment wasn't just about rules, it was about power. And power wasn't being shared, it was being hoarded, protected by centuries of expectations dressed up as culture and values. Every single day of her upbringing, the inequality women faced was passed down like an heirloom. But while others wore it like a burden, she began to see it differently. She started questioning, challenging, remembering, and memory became her greatest source of truth, because you can't fight what you can't see, and she had seen it clearly from the very beginning. The double standards, the muted potential, the conditioned silence, she never forgot the way the world made her feel small. And every time she stepped into a space she was told she didn't belong in, she carried those memories like armor. From the very beginning, gender roles were not presented to her as choices. They were handed to her like unspoken rules she was expected to follow without resistance. Before she even understood what her talents were, someone else had already decided what her limits should be. It wasn't said outright. No one looked her in the eyes and declared what she couldn't become. But every action, every side comment, every expectation placed on her shoulders told her the same thing: that her role in this world had already been written, and her only job was to follow the script. In her home, the tasks were split quietly, yet definitively. The boys were never asked to clear the dishes, to serve guests, or to stay in the kitchen while the grown-ups talked in the other room. Those tasks fell to her, without question, without thanks. When she expressed interest in the things her brothers were doing, fixing bicycles, learning coding, dreaming of travel, she was told those weren't things girls needed to worry about. Instead, she was reminded to be gentle, to be helpful, to be humble. Even when she excelled, it was viewed as something cute, not powerful. She wasn't raised to compete. She was raised to comply. In her culture, in her classroom, in her conversations, she noticed the way boys were groomed to lead while girls were guided to support. When the boys messed up, people said, "They're just being boys." But if she made a mistake, it was a reflection of her character. Girls should know better. That's not how a girl behaves. These weren't just words, they were warnings. And they reinforced the belief that her gender came with a lifelong list of things she should and shouldn't do. The limitations were everywhere. Boys could dream in full-color astronauts, CEO, athletes, adventurers. Girls were expected to dream safely: teachers, nurses, good wives, good daughters, not because those roles weren't worthy, but because they were assigned without asking her what she wanted. The problem wasn't in the roles themselves, it was in the lack of choice. Freedom was something the boys were handed. She had to fight for it. Every time she showed ambition, there was resistance. When she spoke passionately, they called her dramatic. When she took up space, they said she was too loud. If she questioned authority, she was disrespectful. So she began to notice that the roles they gave her weren't built around her strengths. They were built to control her potential, to make her easier to manage, more acceptable, less threatening. Even her dreams had to be filtered through gender. She saw how the girls who wanted more were labeled as rebels. They weren't celebrated for their courage. They were warned to settle down, find something realistic. Don't get your hopes up. The message was clear. There were invisible lines she was not supposed to cross, and if she did, she would walk alone. And yet, something inside her refused to believe those lines were permanent. Every time someone tried to define her, she rewrote the label silently in her mind. Every time someone tried to reduce her, she silently expanded. She remembered how every time she aimed higher, the world quietly, and sometimes loudly, pushed her back down. The dream didn't die, but it was constantly under pressure. She wasn't just fighting for her goals, she was fighting against the invisible net wrapped around her, woven from people's doubts, stereotypes, and the weight of generations. Her ambition, something that should have been encouraged, was seen as a threat. It wasn't that she wasn't capable. It was that the world wasn't ready to make space for a girl like her to want more, demand more, be more. The reactions came fast whenever she stepped out of line. A raised eyebrow, a joke at her expense, a sudden cold silence in rooms where she once felt welcome. She wasn't being aggressive, she was simply being assertive. But that line was always redrawn depending on who was watching. She learned quickly that ambition had a price if you were a girl. She could be driven, but not too much, confident, but never intimidating, smart, but always humble. The moment she stepped an inch too far, she was called difficult. The moment she asked, "Why not me?" she was labeled arrogant. It wasn't just strangers who made her question herself. Sometimes it came from the people closest to her, those who said they loved her, but feared what she might become. "You're aiming too high," they'd say. "You're dreaming too big." They said it with concern, not cruelty, but the impact was the same. They weren't protecting her. They were projecting their own fear of a world that rarely welcomed powerful women. And every time she heard those words, it felt like a crack in her spirit. But she never let those cracks break her. Instead, she used them to let the light in. The world kept asking her to be less, but she kept asking herself, "What if I'm meant to be more?" And that question became her resistance. That question became her rebellion. Her ambition wasn't loud and flashy. Sometimes it was quiet, steady, relentless. Sometimes it was lonely, but it was always burning. She started to see that her dreams were not the problem. The problem was the system that made her feel guilty for having them in the first place. She remembered being in rooms where she had the best ideas but wasn't taken seriously until someone else repeated them. She remembered being talked over, interrupted, dismissed, then told she was too sensitive when she called it out. The world didn't need her to be less talented. It just needed her to doubt herself enough to stay silent. But she didn't. She took every moment of rejection, every dismissal, every backhanded compliment, and turned it into fuel. Because ambition didn't make her less feminine. It made her more powerful, and once she understood that her drive was not a flaw but a force, everything began to shift. She stopped shrinking to make others comfortable. She stopped apologizing for wanting more. She carried the weight of every woman who had ever swallowed her dreams and decided she would never do the same. There came a moment when she realized no one was going to hand her a place at the table. Not because she didn't deserve one, but because the table was never built with her in mind. The rules, the structure, the systems, they had been designed long before she arrived, and they weren't designed for women like her to lead. She looked around and saw that the spaces she wanted to occupy were already filled with loud voices, firm handshakes, and a deep resistance to anything unfamiliar. And what could be more unfamiliar in those rooms than a woman refusing to be quiet, refusing to be small, refusing to wait her turn? So she stopped waiting. She stopped asking for permission to enter spaces that were never meant to include her. Instead, she started creating her own. When doors stayed shut, she stopped knocking. She built new doors, new stages, new platforms. She no longer wanted to fit in. She wanted to stand out, because fitting in meant shrinking herself, cutting off parts of her power just to be accepted. But standing out meant owning every part of her story, every ounce of her strength, and refusing to compromise any of it. There were days she walked into rooms where no one looked like her, where her voice was the only female one, where her ideas were met with skeptical eyes or polite nods that never turned into action. But instead of walking out, she planted her feet. She spoke louder. She made it impossible to ignore her. Because the world had underestimated her before, and she had seen what she could do when that happened. She had seen that resistance only fueled her determination, and that the discomfort she caused in others was proof she was breaking the mold. She started seeing barriers not as blocks, but as signs she was getting closer to the edge of something worth breaking. She realized that when you start making your own space, the right people will find you. Women who felt the same way began to rise around her. They didn't need saving. They needed a signal, proof that they weren't alone in wanting more, needing more, building more. She became that signal. Not because she had it all figured out, but because she was bold enough to begin. Every move she made, every risk she took, became a blueprint for others to follow. She wasn't trying to dominate the old systems. She was trying to reinvent them. She was tired of the rules, tired of the quotas, tired of being the only in the room. So she decided to make more rooms. She made space not just for herself, but for all the women who had ever been told they were too much, too loud, too emotional, too ambitious. She knew those words were never criticisms. They were warnings from a world scared of her power, and power, when shared, only multiplies. So she widened the path, left the door open behind her, and turned every ceiling into a floor for someone else to rise. She didn't become powerful because everything was handed to her. She became powerful because of what she had to fight through. Her strength wasn't built in comfort, it was carved out of resistance. She wasn't shaped by applause, but by the silence she had to break through just to be heard. People often assume strength comes from victory, but hers came from the battles no one saw, the tears she wiped quietly, the dreams she clung to when no one believed in them but her. What she endured didn't break her, it built her. Every setback, every rejection, every moment of being overlooked forged a deeper resilience, one layer at a time. She carried wounds that weren't visible, wounds from words that belittled her, from being told to stay in her place, from hearing that she was too intense, too emotional, too ambitious, but she never let those wounds close her off to the world. Instead, she turned them into wisdom. She didn't just heal, she transformed, and what she built from that transformation wasn't just survival. It was a new kind of power, the kind rooted in self-awareness and forged in adversity. Power that didn't rely on dominance, but on understanding what it meant to rise after being pushed down over and over again. There were nights she cried in silence, doubting whether she was enough, questioning if she was strong enough to keep going. But even in those moments of vulnerability, a voice deep inside her whispered, "Keep going." That whisper became a roar because every time life tried to knock her down, it underestimated her will to get back up, and getting up became her ritual. It became her silent rebellion. The more resistance she faced, the more she grew. The more limits she encountered, the more she stretched beyond them. She never waited to be rescued. She became her own rescue, while others were waiting for signs, for approval, for someone to show them the way. She was already moving. She didn't let the world's narrow definitions of success confine her. She built her own. She didn't wear her trauma as weakness. She wore it as a reminder of what she had survived, and each survival added a new thread to her strength. She became a tapestry of pain turned purpose, of struggle turned strategy. She didn't just rise for herself, she rose so others would know they could too, and that kind of strength, the kind that's built on scars, not surface, is unshakable. She knew her value not because someone validated it, but because she had proven it to herself again and again in the quiet moments when no one was watching. That's where real power lies, in the choices made when the world isn't applauding. And her power was undeniable because it wasn't borrowed or imitated. It was earned inch by inch, forged in every moment where she refused to give up, refused to shrink, refused to settle. She never saw remembering as weakness. In fact, her memory was her sharpest weapon. While others wanted to forget the injustices, the silence, the daily battles that women like her endured, she chose to carry them forward, not to be bitter, but to remain awake. She understood that forgetting allowed systems to reset, but remembering kept her vision clear. The past was not something she buried, it was something she studied. She examined it like a map, looking for patterns, understanding the traps, recognizing where others had fallen so she could walk differently. Memory didn't chain her, it fueled her. She remembered every moment when she was told to lower her voice while others were encouraged to raise theirs. She remembered being underestimated, not because of her skill, but because of her gender. Those memories stayed etched in her bones, not as pain, but as purpose. Every time she looked around and saw inequality continuing, she felt the weight of every woman who came before her, whose names were forgotten, but whose struggles paved silent roads she now walked. She didn't just remember her own pain, she remembered theirs too. There's a dangerous comfort in forgetting. It's easy to move forward and pretend that everything has changed, but she knew better. She knew how deeply inequality could be disguised as progress. She remembered being the only woman in the room, celebrated publicly yet privately isolated. She remembered how success sometimes came at the cost of belonging, and she vowed that if she ever rose, she wouldn't rise alone. Remembering made sure of that, because when you remember what it felt like to be excluded, you build inclusion as a reflex, not a strategy. She never let others erase the truth in the name of politeness. When people said, "Don't dwell on the past," she heard, "Don't challenge the comfort we've built around ignoring the truth." But she refused to ignore it. She refused to smooth it over because if she forgot the inequality, she risked becoming part of it, and she wasn't here to blend in. She was here to disrupt. Remembering gave her clarity. Remembering gave her fire. And that fire was necessary not just to light her path, but to ignite those still in the dark. She saw remembering as an act of rebellion. In a world that tells women to move on, to let it go, to smile through it, she chose to remember with her head high. She remembered not for revenge, but for revolution, because change doesn't come from pretending the past never happened. It comes from honoring it, learning from it, and refusing to repeat it. Every story of exclusion, every act of dismissal, every ceiling that had to be shattered. She held them close, not because they defined her, but
One
because
more.
they reminded her like a quiet truth always burning behind her eyes. The world saw the woman she had become, but she never forgot the girl who had to fight to get here, who dreamed while being told not to, who questioned while being asked to stay quiet, who remembered everything they wanted her to forget.